Hey friends, how's it going? In today's drawing tutorial, what we'll do is practice on shading using watercolors. This is going to be really for beginners with watercolors, as a lot of people find that medium quite challenging. So what we're gonna do is use these three cubes to practice watercolors, and we'll do some very basic shadings. Each cube will be shaded in a different angle, and so you'll be able to understand exactly how to use the watercolors for that. Now, a few tips before we begin. Here, notice how I taped, I'm not sure if you can see this, but I taped the paper to the table. That way I can make sure that when the watercolor hits the paper, it won't crumple up too much. It's very important, especially if you're using a thinner paper like I do. Another important advice before you begin is to actually use ink that's waterproof so that it doesn't get smeared when you bring in the water. The watercolors, and they're mixed with a lot of water sometimes, especially in the beginning when we're gonna do the first layer, and we want to make sure it's really light. And so this is really key. So remember, tape the paper and use ink that's waterproof. I'm not sure if that's the right word. Just ink that won't smear when you put water on it. So what I'm going to do is zoom in on this cube and we'll get to work. Okay, so let's begin. In the first cube, what we're going to do is have the light come in the simplest angle possible, which is just from above. So imagine light coming from this direction and hitting the cube. What we're gonna see is that the light will cause everything that's in direct contact with it to be really bright. And basically what it means is that this top part is gonna be very bright. These bottom parts are gonna be shaded, and all the floor around the cube is gonna be really bright as well. So we'll begin just by, and this is what I like to do, applying a very, very light tone to the entire cube. This is very light. You may not even be able to see this tone that I'm doing here, but it's really important because with watercolors you really want to start as bright as possible and then gradually go and use a darker tone. It could be that I'm using even a too much bright of a tone, but we'll go with that. I think it should be good. And when working with watercolors, you want to work with there's this plump sort of area that has a water, like a drop. You see this? What I'm doing is actually moving that drop around, making sure to equally divide it on the surface that I'm coloring, as equally as possible, and making sure there's no blob left. So this is basically it for the first layer. I may make it a tad more, a little more dark, just for the hell of it. Let's do this, just so that you can see. Usually I won't recommend going over a layer when it's not dry yet, but it's okay just for the sake of this example. Also, what I have actually is a piece of paper to the left that you can't really see, that I use in order to test the color before I put it on the paper. This is really important. I can bring it closer so you can see it. This. I test everything on that, and you can see the shadow of the glass of water here that I use to mix with the watercolors. So this is it for the first layer. What we want to do now is wait for a few seconds, a few moments, even a few minutes, so that it completely dries, and then we'll come back with a second layer. So let's allow it a few moments and continue when it's dry. So what I'm doing here is mixing a little darker tone of black than I used before. This is actually not pure black, it's black mixed with this sort of bluish tone, I think. Anyway, remember how I said light comes from above. So this side of the cube is going to be rather light. What we want to do is shade these two other sides, this one and this one, and we'll leave the area below the cube actually just the way it is right now, because it's fairly well lit. So let's begin. Simply going over, using a second layer of the watercolor. Now, what you'll notice is that watercolor actually dry lighter and brighter than they appear to be when you first put them on paper, which is good. It's easier to accidentally use too much of a dark tone, so it's pretty good that it works this way. And also know that it's really difficult, for me personally at least, it's very difficult to actually mix a similar tone. For example, I used this tone for the left side, and it can be quite a challenge if the color runs out of the brush to actually mix another one that's similar. And it's okay, it works well that way. This is what makes watercolors, I think, special in a way, because the tone doesn't have to be like perfectly even for all areas, and it'll still look quite good. So that's okay. And believe it or not, we're actually done with this cube. This is it, just two tones. This one's the bright part, these are the darker. Below that, because light hits everything so directly, we don't even have a small shadow below that. I just want to leave it as is. And we can move on to the next cube. So for the next one, what I want to do is have the light actually come in this direction. So it's coming from the top right area. And what this means is that we're gonna have this corner and this corner rather bright, and the bottom left one darker. So I'm first mixing in again a tone that's very bright, which I'm gonna use for the all the cube's sides. And I'm mixing it with more water this time. Just because it'll be easier to cover up larger spaces that way. There's a small hair that happens too. Sometimes a small hair from the brush just falls. This is the fun thing about watercolors. They're just so dynamic, and things get messed up in the process without you even noticing sometimes, and it adds to their grace. Even the thing with staying within the lines is less, can be less, you can be less pragmatic with it. I hope that's the right word. You can work more freely, even if you kind of stepped out of the lines, it's okay. Still, it'll look good because this medium is so dynamic. It's like there's so much chaos going on that it's okay. So now we're done applying the first layer. Again, not something too interesting, I'm just putting layers of color here. You can notice that the paper crumples a bit, which is okay. The thing is that once you remove the tape from around it, it'll work itself out. But if we wouldn't use the tape around, it would get much more crumpled, trust me. So now we wait for a few moments for it to dry, and then finally we'll add the shadow. We can actually begin working on the first layer of the shadow because it should have a similar tone to the cube itself, just the first layer. So I'm now mixing the tone I want. And then I don't have a specific guideline, but because light comes from this way, we have the shadow move together with the shape of the cube. This is what you want to imagine. So what I'm doing is actually just continuing this line of the cube and moving away from it. Just like that. I'm not going to obsess about having it really accurate, as long as it just looks good in my mind. Now, a cool trick to use here is usually when you first lay down the color, and this is what happens here, when you first lay down the color, it'll be darker. So what you want to do is begin working from the darkest area outwards. If I begin from here, this would be darker and it won't look good, because a shadow in this situation would be darkest here and will gradually become brighter. So you want to play that out to your advantage, the fact that the first lines you place are the darkest. So that's pretty much it for the shadow. We may not even need a second layer. Now, because light comes from here, again, we're going to wait for this to dry out a bit and then make these two sides a bit darker. So let's wait it up. I'll actually have to wait, you won't, and I'll see you in a second. As I said, light comes from here. These two parts are going to be brighter, and this is the only part that's going to be dark. So I'm going to begin applying the second layer. You'll notice how the color sort of ended around here. So you need to be a little creative and sort of mix it up again with what you already put. A good trick can be just using the side of the brush. I find that it helps mix two different tones together. And believe it or not, we're actually done with this cube as well. So now we'll move on to the final one, which is gonna have the light come from a slightly different direction, and we'll wrap it up. Okay, we're finally moving on to the final cube. Here what I want to do is have the light come from this direction, meaning forward towards us. What this will do is actually coming straight at us, and what will happen is this side is going to be bright, while these two sides are going to be darker, and we'll have a different shadow than the last example, because the shadow will move towards this area. So what you want to do when shading in general is imagine that light moves in straight lines. So if the line comes forward like this, what we're gonna have is this area shaded, hitting the corners and moving towards us. I'll actually use a pencil to show you what it'll look like. So yeah, light comes from here, and what we'll have is actually this part and also this part like this, and all of that area here is gonna be shaded. Okay, and in addition we'll have the cube's two sides that are darker and the upper side that's brighter. So let's get to work using the watercolors. First we'll actually darken the whole thing up. I want to work a little different this time. Mixing here some black. You can't see, but this is what I'm doing actually. I'm mixing the black color with the water and testing it. I like to use a lot of water this time, just to make sure I cover large spaces. And we'll begin. Just a quick note, you can actually, if you don't like to give the entire cube a tone, you can actually just leave the top part white, or if you want to create a really strong reflection. I prefer in this video to actually have it all toned and only then work with a second layer of shadow, but you can definitely just decide to leave the top part completely white just to have this very strong shiny effect. You can do whatever you want basically. So this is it for the cube, but we can already begin working on the first layer of the shadow here at the bottom. So I'm just gonna lay it out like this. And remember what I said, it's always beginning from darker to brighter. So I would first prefer working on the part that's directly underneath the cube and then moving outwards. And I'm working fairly quickly. I find that it works better for me, but you can definitely take your time more. So now you see something interesting happened. I used too much of a dark tone. I can simply dab it off using a toilet paper and remix the tone to have it to my liking. And I continue moving out from the cube. Aside from using that test page to test the color, I'm actually using it to get rid of some of the color. I like to eliminate some of it, especially if I'd like to produce a brighter tone. So I use it to just get rid of some of the color, and then when I apply it to the page here, it won't be as dark. And you can see it's moving from dark to bright. You don't actually have to work like that. You can simply use multiple layers to darken it, which we will do in a moment. We will apply a second layer to the shadow. So yeah, this is it for the first layer. Now we're gonna wait for a while for it to dry out, and then when I'm back, we'll darken these two corners, these two sides, and we'll leave the upper part completely bright, just as it is now. And we will apply a second darker layer to the shadow, and we will begin working on it just like we did so far from this area and downwards. Some people won't like the fact that I work with the first layer already in gradients. Many people prefer to apply an even layer, entirely even, and then come back and use a second layer to darken it. But again, you can try it out, see what works for you. This is what works for me sometimes, so this is what I do. So let's allow it a few moments and continue then. Okay, now we have the color dried. You may have noticed that it became brighter in the process, just like I mentioned earlier. This is normal. Now what we're going to do is first begin shading these two sides, and then we'll move on to the shadow. I'm going to use a fairly darker tone for this, just to create a stronger contrast. Stronger than in the last two examples, I guess. It can look good with stronger contrast. Actually, one of the most important components when trying to get things to look more realistic, which is not really the example here, but still, is contrast. You'll notice that usually the main difference between, if you take a photo of an object, as opposed to actually trying to draw it, most of the people tend to have their drawing too flat, and they use less contrast than they need to. So what I'm trying to do here is just use a little more than in the previous examples. And you can go overboard with it, but we don't care. We'll just go for it. And so this is it for the two sides here. Now let's begin working on the shadow itself. I'll actually need to mix in some more black tone here. And I'll begin working on the shadow from the uppermost part and to the bottom. I'll actually do this in two parts. First, I'll work on the left side, and then I'll move back and work on the right side. This is just a matter of choice. It doesn't really matter where you begin. And I'll go back for some more color here. Perhaps I'll find a way to place the camera or the things I have to the left in a way that you will be able to see them in a future video. I'll need to think about that. And continuing to work on the shadow. Now about here, at this point I want to stop it and sort of blend it in. And to do that also I'll use the side of the brush here. And what you can also do is use the dabbing trick here as well, just to get rid of some of it when you're not interested in having it so dark. And I believe this is it. The contrast could be even stronger here, but let's leave it at that. I'll just zoom out and show you all the three examples together. Okay, perfect. So there we have it. On the left, we have this first cube in which light comes from above. These two sides are darker, this one's brighter. The floor is hit equally, just like the cube, and so it is completely bright. Here we have one that has the light come from the side. Only one side is darker. These two are brighter. And finally, we have this cube in which light comes straight from directly in front of us with these two sides and some of the shadow to the bottom. You can really, with watercolors, you really need to find what works best for you. You may find that actually just layering it and not trying to go for a gradual tone will work better. And quite frankly, it's easier that way. What I tried to do here is a little more complex, and actually it would be easier for me to also just place a layer and then a second one. And that's it. You know, with watercolors you really need to, just like writers need to find their voice, you kind of need to find your your watercolor voice, the thing that works best for you. So just take time to play around with it, mix the colors the way you want, work freely, don't have any constraints, don't expect anything specific. What I like to do is actually go out, sketch something out, and then just use watercolors to really bring it to life. I would use a very minimal sketch, something really simple, and then I'll just add the watercolors just to get it to look, to pop. So this is a good exercise. To me it's always easier to actually sketch, draw, and color something that I'm looking at directly. And that's it for today. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to my channel, and also follow the link below to sign up for my my newsletter, which is something cool in which I publish things that I don't publish here. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video.